This conference will now be recorded.
All right, anyone, any questions, guys, before we get started?
Sir,
Good, please.
sir, in Visual Studios, when we are merging one branch to another branch, no, sir,
Mm-hmm.
in Visual Studios. So in
Okay.
that, is there one is main branch is there and something called origin slash head, like origin main.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we merge that two, sir? Like we have to take main or origin main like that.
Origin main is nothing but usually your main and origin main are both the same. Origin is nothing but the one that you really pulled out from, or the code that you really pulled out from the, let's say, okay, just a second. The code that you really pulled out from your dev.azure.com, and after that, if you make some changes on top of it, that is going to become a main branch out there. So you can take the main branch since it has the latest changes. So anything which has the latest changes, you can just take that out.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Someone says, what is fast forward merge and what is no fast forward? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in, let's say, something called merges and all those things out here as such. We'll see what really that means, where does that concept really come into picture, and so on and so forth. Yes, anyone, any more questions, guys? So the last class I remember, we were doing something called branch policies. We were just, let's say, understanding what do you mean by a branch policy? How do you set up a branch policy? Why is a branch policy really required? And how do you, or what kind of a branches are there in place? For example, we said whenever you create a repository, you have a main branch which is logged for, let's say, obvious purposes. Then you have something called as a develop branch, and then as a developer, I cannot really direct commit onto my develop branch. Reason being, the branch has policies on top of it, which will restrict me to go ahead and do some kind of a changes. And then as a developer, I go ahead, create a feature branch, and then merge it back into that particular develop branch out here. And we were looking into something or called branch policies, but now what I want to get into is something called as branching and merging strategies out here. So this class today is more going to be theory, but very, very important theory on which the remaining explanation is really going to rely upon. So please follow along and let me know if you have any issues out here. If you have anywhere, if you're not able to follow, please let me know. I'll stop there and I'll re-explain it once again. So in order to explain the branching and merging strategies, let's take a case study of a company called Apple, who is designing a software called iOS. Is designing, let's say, a software called iOS, and let's say the current version that they're developing is something called iOS 15. So there is Apple who wants to go ahead and develop something called iOS 15. So what firstly they do is that firstly they go ahead and create a repository for the same thing called iOS application. Let's take this as a repository. And as and when you create a repository, the branch that you get here is a main branch. So I created a repository. Let's go ahead with something called Azure repos. I have a repository, and as and when I create a repository, we get a branch called as a main branch out here as such. So the main branch inside this particular repository called iOS application. And again, as we said earlier, the main branch needs to be logged. So this branch needs to be logged out here. You cannot do direct commits on this branch. So I'm just giving you an ideal example that the company might be doing something like that. So branch is logged. We cannot go ahead and do a direct commit if the branch is logged, which means that I can just come here, just click on these three dots, just put a log on top of it. And as and when I have a log on top of it, you won't be able to do a direct commit on top of this particular branch. And from this branch is acting as a backup branch. It's acting like a backup. And post that, we are creating something called as a develop branch from it. There is something called as a develop branch that we are creating from your main branch. So you have a develop branch so that the developers can go ahead and merge their changes into this particular branch. So I'll say a new branch, and I'll say it as a develop branch out here. Created from the main branch, and I'll say create. And again, as we were telling, as a developer, I shouldn't really go ahead, or rather, I shouldn't really go ahead and commit directly onto the develop branch, because there might be multiple developers working in my organization. And if everyone commits to the same branch out here, there might be a lot of issues with the code quality, with, let's say, the conflicts and all these things out here. So as a DevOps engineer, I go ahead, put something called as a branch policy on top of it. So I just go ahead and say that I at least need one reviewer in place. I really need just one reviewer, and since I'm the only person in the organization, I'll say allow requesters to approve their own change, and I'll just come back. What this is going to do is that this is now going to place something called as a branch policy out here. So branch policies, and here the branch policy is just telling me that you cannot do a direct commit on top of this particular branch. This is not really allowed. So in order to commit on top of this branch, please use something called as a feature pull request. So whatever change that you want to do on this particular branch, as a developer, the first thing that I need to do is that go into my local laptop, do a clone operation of this particular branch. So I'll clone this branch out here by using like a git clone operation on my VS Code. And once I clone it, I'll create a new branch in my local machine called feature branch. Feature something, or feature branch, something like this, and push all my changes by using a pull request between the feature and the develop. There is a pull request that gets created between the feature and the development. As a developer, what I'll push here, my code, whatever code that I have, I'll just push all that particular code inside this particular branch out here as such. So let's do that. So I am a developer. I come here into my develop branch. I'll say clone. I'll say clone in VS Code. I'll say open in VS Code out here. And this is going to open up, let's say, the Visual Studio Code for me. And let me say open. And once that's done, it's going to ask me which location that I want to, let's say, clone my repository under. I'll take this particular junk folder. As I select this particular repository location, and it's now performing something called as a git clone operation. I'll say yes, I want to open this out. I don't save this, and I'm now opening up that particular folder. And the branch that I'm working on right now, I can change this to something called as a develop. So I can change my branch into something known as a develop branch out here right now. And what I can do as a developer right now is, as a development team, I can go ahead, and earlier, if you'll remember, while we are doing web apps, we were using Visual Studio in order to write some code, right? So I'll do the same thing. I'll use Visual Studio, and as a developer, I'll start my development operation. So I'll say, okay, fine, I'll create a new project, and I'll take that project as .NET Core. So I'll say .NET Core, I'll say next. I'll say this is iOS application. And what I'll do right now is just see this, guys. I am storing the code in the same folder that got cloned. I'm using this particular folder called iOS application. I'll say next, and I'll say, okay, fine. Please go ahead and, let's say, create this out. Sorry, please go ahead and create, let's say, the .NET Core in 3.1. I'll say create. So I'm now creating a sample project inside this particular folder. And if you see in the background, right, it's now going ahead and creating something called as an iOS application as a folder inside which it's going ahead and giving me all these projects out here as such. So it's going ahead creating me something called as iOS application as a name of the application itself inside a folder called iOS application again. and I have one simple, let's say, application that is ready. As and when I do that, this is what I have right now. I have a folder. Inside this folder, I have something like an iOS application, or if I just go into my junk folder right now, I have something called iOS application, inside which I have one thing called iOS application, and then I have the solution files. I have all my code out here that is ready. This is what I, as a developer, has created this out. And as and when I did that, if you look into, let's say, the changes, it's saying all these changes are ready to be committed. Do you want to commit this out? Again, since I'm working on the develop branch, and since the develop branch is also protected, I cannot go ahead and directly go ahead and commit on top of the develop branch out here. What I can do, I can click on this branch. I'll say create branch from, and I'll say feature forward slash my name forward and say hyphen something like code push. Since I'm doing a code push out here, I'll say enter. I'll say please base it out of, let's say, the develop branch, and I'll now go ahead stage all my changes, and I'll say this is a code push, and I'll say commit everything out here. So I'm committing everything. I'll publish my branch. So when I hit the publish branch out here, this will go ahead create a branch out here for me on my repository. So if I just go ahead refresh the screen, I now have a branch called Kiran Code Push that is ready to be merged. And now I create a pull request between that particular branch and the develop branch, because develop branch is my primary branch that I need to, let's say, commit this out. I'll say create, and once created, it is waiting for someone to approve this out. And since I am allowed to approve my own change, I'll say approve, I'll say complete, and I will delete the branch after the merging is done, because I don't want to have my feature branches again and again. So I'm just going ahead deleting this particular branch from the repository, and if I come back here, I now have all the changes that are there inside this particular develop branch, and all my code is now ready. So all I did is created a simple code. Uh, Same thing what we did in earlier demos while we are doing web apps. We just created a simple code and just stored it. Now what I'm doing, I'm not doing a build. If you remember earlier when I was, let's say, going ahead and using that web application as an example, we were doing a build and then publish. I'm not doing anything like that. I'm just going ahead writing my code, storing my code inside the repository, and I'm using a clone operation, and after that a pull request operation in order to, let's say, get this process done out here as such. Yes, any questions till here that I can take? Anyone, any questions that I can take till you?
Can you explain the same part once again, sir?
Uh, so when you say same part, what exactly do you want in the entire
Sir,
thing?
like
What exactly
we
do
are
you want to
creating
know? Mhm.
some in visual code starting from project, sir. So after that, we merge into the developer. So from future,
Mhm.
that
Again, from feature, did you try this out to go ahead and use a feature branch and merge it into the develop branch? Did we try it out earlier also?
last class, yes, sir, we tried no, sir. In practical
Yes.
also, I have tried, sir.
Okay, in practical also you tried. So what I'm doing today is just creating the code inside the same branch and merging it back. So I created a develop branch in my Azure DevOps repository, cloned it into my local machine. So as and when I cloned it into the local machine, I have the code, or I had earlier just this particular readme.md file. Using a Visual Studio Code or using a Visual Studios, I created a project, save that project into the same folder where it is cloned so that Git can track all these changes. Once that's done, created a branch and I published the branch out here as such. This is what I did, and this is what I did. And after that, I just went ahead, created a pull request between my feature branch and the develop branch out here as such. So this is what I have done on an end-to-end, in let's say on the end-to-end basis out here as such. Did you get that?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. No, I got.
Is any more questions, guys?
Good
Anyone?
morning,
Any
sir.
questions? Good, please.
Sir, actually, we are sir. Initially, we are locking that main branch, right? Once
Correct,
we log that main branch, we cannot perform any kind of commit operations and that thing.
correct, correct.
So once we log, is it possible to perform any merge operation, pull operation from the normal branches to the main branch?
No, it shouldn't be possible. Since the branch is locked, you
Mm-hmm.
cannot do a pull request also. You cannot even do
Acha.
the pull request to that particular branch.
As you said, it's a default main branch is used for mainly backup purpose. Now, so when they are going to developers or any persons in the organization, when they are going to pull all these to the main branch.
Which we'll look at right now on how that is really pulled out, or from where that is really pulled out, and so on and so forth.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll see
Got
that once we understand the entire flow of how the software is developed, then we'll get our main branch into picture also as such.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, so this develop branch again, I'll just put this out. This is a sorry, this feature branch, sorry, is a short-lived branch. This is now something known as a short-lived branch out here as such. Put the PR here and let me point out here and telling that the reason this is short-lived branch is because as and when your pull request is merged, the branch is deleted and the branch is no longer existing on the Azure DevOps portal out here as such. Now, one question, guys, is that until here, what are the responsibilities of a DevOps engineer? Is this? See, as a DevOps engineer, we are primarily responsible to create repository, to create branches under the repository, like the main branch and like the develop branch, and also establish branch policies on top of that particular branch out here so that the developers don't do a direct commit out here as such. So until here, this is our responsibility. Pushing the code is the responsibility of a developer. Making sure to push the code is the responsibility of a developer. So the developer in their own machines, they write the code and they push the code into inside this particular branch using a pull request. And once the code is there, that's where the developer's work is done. The developer is just going and giving the code. And now all the code that is sitting in your branch, right? All this is in a high level language, right? Because this is now a .NET Core application. All this is now in a high level language out here.
Sir,
Good, please.
sir, you told that developer will push the code into that repository, no, sir.
Hmm.
So, how can they get the access, sir? Like they pull into this repository. So it comes this Azure DevOps comes one organization, no, sir, admin organization, something. If example,
Admin organization. This is the admin account. In that way, you
yes,
can
sir,
go ahead and add people. So, for example, you can
yes.
go into your organization. You can add multiple developers here under the users. You can say add
Okay, sir.
users,
Like, yes, sir.
just like you did it in Azure. Let's say in the Azure portal. I did not come to the user management yet, so I will tell how the user management is also done. But I
Okay,
can
sir.
just go ahead, add the developer, and give them the access. I'll also show that and how this is done.
Yes, sir. Okay,
Yes, but good question though. Yes, but yes, each and every developer is added into the Azure DevOps and they use their own accounts in order to go ahead and let's say do all these pull requests and so on and so forth out here as such. But yes, as I was telling, the developer has done his work. They went ahead and they used their own knowledge to develop all this code. They developed all this code or they wrote all this code and they are placing all this code inside the develop branch of my repository out here as such, which is called iOS application. So I have an iOS application as a repository inside which I have a branch, inside which I put all my code out here. I'm good, I'm done. Now, as a DevOps engineer, it is my responsibility to change this code from a high level language to a low level language. And this process is called as a build. And in Azure DevOps, this process of build is achieved by using something called as a pipeline. Something called as a pipeline out here as such. So I did not really go into the concept of pipeline, but I'm just giving you an overview on what is the purpose of having a pipeline out here. A pipeline. And this pipeline is called as a build pipeline out here as such. So very simple. This pipeline goes ahead and gets the code from a source like develop branch. So it just goes ahead, reads, let's say, this entire, let's say, code, or pulls this entire code from this particular develop branch out here. So in the develop branch, you have all the high level code. We'll see how the integration is done, but I'm just giving you an idea on what really happens out here. So all the code is there inside the develop branch. The pipeline just goes ahead, pulls out the code from the develop branch out here, and converts the code into something like a low level language or binaries, or in the language of Azure DevOps, we call them as artifacts. In the language of Azure DevOps, we call this as an artifact out here. So let's look at this. So this pipeline is attached to your develop branch, and as and when the pipeline goes ahead, does what it does, it goes ahead and creates you something called as an artifact out here, or artifacts out here as such. So the end result of a build pipeline will always be something known as an artifact. So I'll just go ahead, build your code, just convert your code into something known as artifact. And then once that's done, what we do is that take this artifact and use another pipeline service. Now I'm giving you an overview of what pipeline is. I do not really explain, I do not really go into it, which we'll do in coming classes. But in order to explain this entire life cycle and how the code is actually developed, I'm just giving you an idea here. So we take this artifact into something called as a release pipeline. So remember in VS Code also, right? We used to just click on here and say build, and after build we used to do a publish. Now these two operations are replaced by something called pipelines, which is called build and release pipelines, or build or publish pipelines, you can call it in that way. And build and publish, or build and release pipelines together, they form the heart of DevOps. These two together, right? They form the heart of DevOps out here as such. So we take the code into the build pipeline, we build the code, convert the code into, let's say, a low level language, process that particular, let's say, artifact using a release pipeline, and then finally deploy it onto a cloud. So using release pipeline, you're just doing a deployment onto a cloud called Azure. In our case, since we're using Azure, I'll just get in our cloud here. This is where your deployment, or this is where your Azure DevOps and Azure portal are integrated together. So we are taking the release pipeline and we are putting the code inside the Azure portal. So this is the Azure, and you have a subscription, and let's say that you deliver this code into a web application that is running as a part of an app service plan. So I have a resource group. Let me put this in. I have a resource group. Inside that resource group, I have a web application that is running as a part of an app service plan. And this is where I'm integrating the knowledge that we have on the Azure portal that we learned so far. So using that particular, let's say, release, or let me do one thing, let me change this out. So now, as a part of this particular release procedure, so if you start this with, again from the basic, uh, I as a developer, I'm, let's say, merging all my code using a feature branch into the develop branch of your repository. Once that's done, the develop branch will go ahead and, let's say, trigger off something called, or let me take this all out. Once that's done, the develop branch will go ahead, and since the develop branch is attached to a pipeline called as a build pipeline, this pipeline will simply go ahead, do what it has to do, and produce something known as artifacts at the end. So I'll just go ahead, give some artifacts at the end out here. And from a release pipeline, I take this artifact, I process it out, I deploy it onto a cloud called Azure. this is where my delivery happens. So it's a continuous integration and a continuous delivery, which I am doing using something called Azure DevOps. And as and when this is deployed, right? Now the deployment doesn't happen like, let's say it's a final deployment and so on and so forth. The deployment happens in the form of stages, meaning I'll take the code. Let's say this is an iOS application, right? Let's say this is iOS version 15 that I'm developing, in which I'm developing right now. As of now, all your iPhone users are using, let's say, something like iOS 14. Let's imagine that they are using, they are happy with that, they're just doing it. In the background, there is a development team who's already started working on something called iOS 15, and they're developing all these things out in the background. And what happens really is that they take this code and deploy it onto, let's say, the first web application, which I'll call it as a dev web application, as a dev web app. This is only for your developers, meaning as and when the code falls here, all your development team will be able to access this particular web application, test the code, understand how the code really is working, and then move the code into a different stage. When I say a different stage, again, you have something called as a QA web app that is running as a part of, let's say, another app service plan. They have a QA web app which is running as a part of another app service plan out here. And I am just taking the same code that is there in development, putting it into QA, and now all my QAs will go ahead test it out with their own test cases out here. Finally, I'll send the code for my operations team. So I'm not giving the code from my operations team using their local machines. I'm sending it out the code. Let's say, I'm sending the same code onto the cloud, and I'm deploying it onto a different web application called as a stage web app. This is for your QA team, wherein the QA team is telling, okay, fine, let me check this out. Let me see how the code is really working before I deliver it finally into something called as a prod web app, which is a production based environment, which is a live environment here. Production. And let me put it here and say this is finally my production environment. And as and when the code is delivered to the production environment, you as a user on your phone, you'll get a notification telling, you know what, iOS 15 is now available. And you can go ahead and download this out. So now if you see this, right, this entire life cycle happens in a very planned phase. So I'm starting from my repository creation, and after repository, I'm creating my branches. I'm locking the main branch because this is supposed to be a backup branch. After that, I'm going ahead and telling that, okay, fine, this is the develop branch, which is called iOS 15, which holds the iOS 15 code. I'm doing a build, then I'm doing a release into the Azure portal, and even the release is happening in a very periodic manner. Each and every release takes a sprint cycle. In my case, for one software to, let's say, go ahead and deliver, I'm taking 1 year. I'm taking 1 year of the entire development life cycle out here, where I'm telling, you know what, I am going ahead and delivering it in the form of phases out here as such. Yes, any questions still here on what we are doing and why we are doing this out here as such? Yes, anyone, any questions still here? Anyone who's not following, anyone who's confused about it? Anyone, any questions still here that I can take?
Uh, Hi, sir. After the deployment, can you just show you the bit of overflow? Like after
Uh,
releasing the pipeline, yeah.
yes, after
Yeah.
deployment, so deployment is going on to the Azure cloud. So initially,
Okay.
I'll deploy it onto a web application called Dev Web App. So what I'll do is that I'll have multiple web applications, multiple resource groups. And the reason that I have multiple is because each and every team wants to test their own changes out there, right, on the cloud. So what I'll do is that since I'm iOS, I'm Apple, I have a lot of budget out here. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I will go ahead and create multiple web applications calling Dev Web App, QA Web App, Staging Web App, and Production Web App out here. So using my release pipeline, I'll simply take the developed code and I'll firstly deploy it on the dev web app, and I'll ask my developers to go ahead and test it out, telling that okay fine, you know what, test your code, see your changes, see whether it's working fine. If it's working fine, it's okay. We'll go ahead and send it to the QA department. If it's not working fine, again go back, take the feature branch, rebuild your code, meaning take the feature branch, correct your code, merge it to the develop, again come with the build, again come with the release, again deploy it onto the development, and then test it out. If it's still not working, again do the same side, like again do the same procedure until the testing is done. And once it's done, go to the QA. And QA will take the same code onto a different web app, test it out, meaning the link will be different of the application. They'll test it out. They'll use their own test cases, see how it works out. And once they say, okay, fine, this is good, we will send it to the operations team for the final release. Operations team will have their own, let's say, discussions with the client to tell them that okay fine, this is your software, this is how it's going to look like, and finally they'll send it on to the production. And once the code hits the production, you as a user will get a notification on your application or on your phone or on your laptop telling that okay fine, the new version of iOS is ready, do you want to install this out. So this is the delivery procedure that is happening, and this is an incremental procedure that is happening. If you look at this, I'm not directly taking my code and sending it to the client. This is would not work in all the cases because your application might have a lot of issues. You cannot give, let's say, a lot of issues to your let's say, to the end user out there. So that's the reason we do it in a very periodic manner, in a very phased manner out here as such. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. So, if a developer wants to create a multiple feature branches, so can he do that?
Yes, he can do that. He can create multiple feature branches, but whatever feature changes he's making should ultimately come into the develop branch. Should ultimately come
Okay.
into the develop branch for build and release.
Okay. Got it. Got it. Thank you, sir.
Sir,
Good, please.
sir, in we have that two branches like main and develop. So
hmm
in main branch, log that no, sir. Like whatever the code is, it
Yes,
will not be changed. So like
yes.
we will change that whatever the code is in develop branch, like creating the future branch.
hmm
Okay, sir. So how it will be available in main branch, sir? Like we cannot, we didn't merge that two branches, no, sir. Like main
Yes,
and that
it's not
develop.
available in the main. Yes, it won't be available in the main until I merge it. So
Okay,
there'll be a
yes.
day when finally the code reaches the production and everyone is happy. Client receives the code. Now what I'll do is that now I'll say, okay, fine. The develop branch, let me log this out too. Let me lock my develop branch. The reason being, there should be no further developmental activities because the code has already gone into, let's say, production. You cannot develop a code that is there in production. So what I'll do is I'll create something called as a release branch. I'll say release version 15. Since it's iOS 15, I'll say release version 15. I'll say, okay, fine, base it out of the develop branch and I'll say create this out. Now I'll change this branch. I'll say, okay, fine, now it's not the develop branch, it's the release branch that you need to use as a developer. I will use a release branch out here, create branches called hotfix branches right now. Every branch that you create on your local machine that goes into develop branch is called as a feature branch. Every branch that you create on your local machine that goes into your release branch is called as a hotfix branch. Calling hotfix branch right now. Now, once as and when I create a release branch, we unlock the main because all the code that is there in the release branch is already there in production environment. The client is already using it. So what I'll now do is I'll unlock it. I'll now create a pull request between my release branch and the main branch. Now, if you see, there are about 67 comments that I'm making right now, and all these are tested. All these are tested, done, and all that stuff. I'll say create, and it's checking for merge conflicts and etc. I'll say complete. I won't delete my release branch out here. I'll say complete the merge. Now, if you see, whatever code that is there in your release branch right now is falling under the main branch, and main branch, once it falls under the main branch out here, once the pull request is complete, we'll again go ahead and log this out. So this is how I am now doing this out. and I'm not supposed to touch the develop branch because I am done with the development activities, and whatever changes that I need to do right now should go into the release branch in the form of hot fixes out here as such.
Okay.
Yes, any more questions, guys? Anyone, any questions still here? So now if you see this, I have a main branch that I'm not using. Okay, fine. I have a main branch that is just for my backups. I have a feature branch, sorry, I have a develop branch, which is the branch that is responsible for primary development activities. And then I have something called as a feature branch used by my developers. It's short-lived. These are used by my developers in order to go ahead and merge the code into develop. And then I have a release branch finally that I created after the code went into production. And then I have something called as a hotfix branch. So I have a couple of branches out here that I'm, let's say, implementing. And I would suggest you all to also go ahead and read the documentation for it. So I'll say Azure DevOps branching and merging strategies. And this is going to tell you what is a Git branching strategy. How do you adopt something? What is a feature branch? What is a main branch? What is a release branch? What is a hotfix branch? And how do you adopt all these things? And how do you, let's say, maintain the code quality out here? So how do you manage the releases and so on and so forth? So this is how we go ahead and achieve the end-to-end procedure or end-to-end process out here. And also, one thing you observe, guys, is that this is just internal for, let's say, this is inside the organization which is happening right now. But every development or every team or every organization that creates a software, right? They'll also have a customer support team. Just imagine this. See, if I, as a user, I'm using iOS 15, let's say, software, and as and when the software got delivered, there are a lot of issues. For example, my phone is getting very much hot. It's not properly getting charged. And I want to complain someone. See, I cannot directly call the developer who's developed this code, right? I cannot directly have a word with the developer and tell that, hey, developer, you know what, this is your issue. I cannot do that. I normally go ahead, have a word with that particular customer support team, and I say, you know what, this is the issue. The customer support team will try to, let's say, perform some initial troubleshooting operations. Like they'll say, okay, fine, can you restart your phone? Can you clear the cache? Can you reset your phone? Something like that. If it still doesn't work, they'll say, okay, fine, you know what, I will involve my development team, and they'll say, okay, fine, developer, and they'll contact the development team over something like a ticketing system, ticketing services. This is where ticketing like ServiceNow and all these things come into picture. So they'll create a ticket for the development team telling that, you know what, I have a contact from, let's say, the customer, and they're telling this. And as and when a customer reports an issue, and as and when more customers report the issue, right, this becomes a production issue, or this becomes, let's say, a major issue out here. So they say, okay, fine. In the ticketing system, they say, okay, fine. You know what? This is a development team. I'll contact the developer. The developer will say, okay, fine. Let me test the same thing at my end. The developer will take the code that is there in the release branch, create his own hotfix branch out here, test it out in his local system, identify the issue, merge the code back into the release branch, do a build, do a release, test it out, and then finally send the code back to the client. Once this is done, I'll no longer call this as iOS 15. I'll call this as iOS 15.1, 15.2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. And each and every time I upgrade the version, I again take the code, merge it back into my main branch because it needs to act as a backup. This is what completes my entire software development lifecycle. So when I say software development lifecycle, the entire diagram that we are going through, right? If we just go through Azure DevOps, let's do Azure DevOps, and we'll just look at the images out here. And this is what it really tells you. Let's see if I have a diagram. Yes, this is what it really tells you out here. Just telling, firstly, repository, store your code, build the code, test your code every time, release the code, monitor the code, see whether you have any tickets or not, plan accordingly, then try to code, then build, test, and etc. This is a continuous cycle of build and delivery out here, which we have put it in the form of this particular diagram on what really happens inside and what are all the teams that are involved out here and how the teams really work with each other and so on and so forth. And this is going to be the future classes. We are going to take this as our base reference and we'll go into something called build and then something called as release out here in the coming weeks. Yes, any questions, guys?
Sir, you told
Mhm.
that artifacts is nothing but converting from high-level language to low-level language,
Correct,
right? If I'm not wrong.
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Build is a process of converting. So build is a process of converting from high level language to a low level language. Once the code
Okay,
is in low level language, we call them as artifacts. So artifact is nothing but
okay,
code in a binary language.
okay, fine. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, this might be confusing right now, but once we implement it out, once we start implementing things out, this will make much more sense. So in the coming classes, we'll see what is a build pipeline, how do you create a build pipeline, how do you maintain, how do you manage a build pipeline, and so on and so forth.
Sir, I have one doubt, sir.
Go ahead, please.
Sir, after code went into the production, we are going to lock the development branch, right?
Correct.
Then we'll create one more release branch something. So if you want, if further any kind of changes, then we'll make changes in the release branch only. Again, we'll send it to the production. No?
Correct.
So here, after performing some changes, again we'll unrelease the lock for development branch lock, and
You
again we are pushing
don't
that
have
code
to.
into that. Mhm.
Again, you don't have to unlock the develop branch. See, develop branch and release branch, right? These are just naming conventions that I am keeping for my convenience because if someone is coming into my project, it's such a huge project. There's so many developers out here. The developer has to know in which phase the project is. Is it in a development phase or is it in a release phase? For this, we separate the release and develop branch out here. It's a best recommendation to do that.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yes. Any more questions, guys? Okay, so in the coming classes, we'll start with build procedures. So tomorrow we might not have a class since it's Diwali, so we will not have a class out there. And from Tuesday, we'll continue with the build procedure out here as such. Thank you, and have a good day, and have a great festival ahead, guys. Thank you.
Happy Diwali, sir. Thank you.